Good day, distinguished guests and colleagues. Welcome to part one of our series on conventional counterforce and strategic stability. Thank you very much indeed for your presence and for your time. My name is Manuel, and I'm a military analyst at Scrap Weapons and a civil engineer. We have a fantastic panel with some of the greatest experts on this topic and a diverse audience of academics, strategic studies, and arms control communities from different countries. On a personal note, one of my desired outcomes for this webinar series is to catalyze dialogue and build bridges on this vital and timely topic, which has received less attention than it deserves. And we will try to discover together why that might be the case. And in terms of formats, I will open with a short presentation, followed by remarks by Professor Lieber, Dr. Zhao, and Professor Plesch. We will then move to a panel discussion before opening the floor to the audience for Q&A. For our panel today, we have Professor Keir Lieber, professor at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown University, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have Dr. Tom Zhao, senior fellow with the Nuclear Policy Program and Carnegie China at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a non-resident researcher at Princeton University's program on science and global security. And we have Professor Dan Plesch, professor of diplomacy and strategy at SOAS University of London, director of Scrap Weapons, and founder of the British American Security Information Council in Washington, DC. I'm just going to present. So, why is conventional counterforce such a vital topic, and indeed why now? The traditional argument is that conventional counterforce weapons are not credible counterforce tools against nuclear peers. They lack the required lethality against hardened silos and deeply buried targets, and detecting mobile launchers or submarines in real time is challenging. And these are valid points, and conventional counterforce does have limitations. We acknowledge them. However, at the heart of the matter, technological advances are blurring the line between conventional and nuclear capabilities, and fundamentally altering deterrence. And I would say that prudent analysts in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, operating under worst-case assumptions, understand that something has shifted since the mid-2000s. And this is mostly due to advances in technology, namely permanent ISR, intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, greater precision, lethality, the range itself of these kinetic systems, along with more diverse delivery systems, and vitally, the synchronous integration between the strike options and ballistic missile defense, or the sword and shield, that is usually termed. And I propose we can call this a new deterrence Zeitenwende, turning point, or borrowing from Professor Lieber and Professor Press, the new era of counterforce. I also propose that we can summarize this new era in one word, and that would be entanglement. So again, the blurring of the lines between conventional and nuclear capabilities, which increases ambiguity between peer rivals. Now, why does this entanglement matter? Because peer rivals cannot distinguish a conventional attack on their strategic assets from preparation for a nuclear first strike. And early warning systems may not resolve the difference until the critical decision time has already elapsed. And this ambiguity increases the risk of misperception in a crisis specifically, and erodes at least the perception of mutual vulnerability, which is the very foundation on which deterrence rests. It's also interesting that Stratcom's testimony to the Armed Services Committee on Strategic Forces on March 17 highlights there's a growing focus on conventional nuclear integration as the means to maintain a credible deterrent. At the same time, and we have to acknowledge this pursuit of dual-use capabilities is not unique to the US at all. Russia has the Calibre, the Rinzal, China has the DF-26 and KD-20. Nonetheless, the greatest disparity lies in the delivery platforms and strategic enablers, and here the US holds an overwhelming advantage over its near-peer rivals. Now, going back to the sword and shield, one cause for this new era of counterforce is the synchronous integration of sword and shield capabilities that combine reinforce the feasibility of conventional counterforce. On the strike side, for instance, the Rapid Dragon system turns cargo aircraft, as you can see in the picture, into cruise missile launchers with palletized JASM variants out of the back of a C-17 transport aircraft. It essentially means that any large transport aircraft can become a standoff strike platform. On the defensive side, the Aegis missile defense system is now usable at sea, on land, and in the air. And 2 years ago, the SM-6 Gunslinger variant was integrated onto the B-2 bomber, with the Missile Defense Agency arguing it could become a key asset to counter hypersonic threats. And again, this last development received almost no coverage in the strategic studies literature. And these developments on BMD opens the possibility of boost phase interception, which is the holy grail of BMD, which is engaging ballistic missiles in the earliest, most vulnerable phase of flight when they are slow, visible to radar, and rising. And deploying an interceptor on a strategic stealth bomber, I would propose, epitomizes entanglement in a single airframe. And obviously, we have the proposed Golden Dome, the layered missile defense system that is designed to intercept kinetic threats from the boost to terminal phases all over the US homeland. Now, a further element of conventional counterforce that is increasingly viable is a defeat of hardened silos precisely due to advances in strike precision. Since the 70s, silo vulnerability was modeled through nuclear overpressure or the air blast coupling energy into the earth. And because of that, conventional weapons were dismissed as being insufficiently lethal. But these traditional models focus on only one category of ground effects, and this was mostly by Army engineers from the US. However, recent research shows that a different mechanism, which is a directly induced ground shock from an underground detonation carried by the missile, is what actually destroys a silo, not the air blast. So if you think when a Tomahawk or a JASM penetrates into the earth beside the silo and detonates, this directly induced ground shock produces particle velocities, which have actually been found to be comparable to a nuclear detonation. And this missile inside the silo, as you can see in the picture, is thrown against the walls. The rattle, space, and shock isolation systems are essentially overwhelmed, and the missile is either destroyed or simply rendered inoperable. And to get into more technicalities, a Tomahawk, for example, with a CP, circular error probable accuracy, has been assessed to achieve a single shot kill probability above 99% against Russian and Chinese silos with pressures at 1,500 psi. And this is without multiple tapping, again, just a single shot, while the JASM exceeds 92%. So these are actually comparable to nuclear ballistic missiles. And at that accuracy, direct impacts onto the silo cover itself compounds the effects. So the lethal area from the ground effect is 8 to 13 times larger than the silo lid itself. This means that even a near miss could be deemed a kill. Therefore, the assumption that conventional weapons cannot threaten hardened silos, at least out of 1,500, which are the most common in China and Russia, has been overtaken by recent research. Now, to close, I would propose that any analysis of conventional counterforce must account for two concepts, which is functional defeat, which is essentially rendering a system unusable, and complete destruction, which is physically eliminating it. For instance, one can block the entrances to submarine tunnels, and the submarines are trapped, so they are unusable, destroying the entrances to underground missile bastions, and the missiles are essentially unusable to be deployed. So these are functional defeat outcomes, which are achieved with conventional precision strike. There are limits, obviously, in conventional counterforce, as stated before, against China's deeply buried tunnel networks, the underground Great Wall, which Dr. Zhao has analyzed at length, with over 5,000 kilometers of tunnels, hundreds of meters deep into granite. Conventional weapons do hit a ceiling imposed by physics. At the same time, even nuclear weapons would struggle against its targets. Therefore, the question is not whether the US can achieve a full disarming strike that achieves complete destruction with conventional weapons. Some threshold of functional defeat may be sufficient to change perceptions. And fundamentally, the question is whether planners in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, operating under worst case assumptions in the fog of a fast moving crisis, believe that these conventional counterforce capabilities are approaching a threshold that changes the overall calculus. And the evidence suggests the answer is yes. Now, that perception alone is reshaping deterrence, and such capabilities are eroding mutual survivability in this new era of counterforce. And it is the reason this topic demands far more attention than it has received. Professor Lieber, I yield, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Surprisingly, I'm not going to actually talk about my prior work about this topic, the new era of counterforce that Manuel referred to, and the whole debate about the new era of counterforce and the technical operational details. Whether we've reached a tipping point or not, I certainly stand by the argument that these advances are making nuclear arsenals more vulnerable. But how vulnerable, which direction things are going is a great debate, not one that I'm going to engage in, at least in my prepared remarks. For example, does a Tomahawk with 3-meter CEP, depends on GPS, and what's the likelihood that there won't be GPS jammers nearby, vital resources like vital capabilities like an ICBM. I'm also surprisingly not going to engage too much on the political impact debate. Does this really undermine strategic stability or not? Or are there benefits here? For what it's worth, I think the new era of counterforce and conventional counterforce capabilities entail both risks and opportunities. And risks are clearly of first strike incentives that states may be more willing to launch counterforce attacks if they have these capabilities. But there are probably also opportunities that maybe deterrence will be bolstered by one side having these capabilities. We're so conditioned to believe that MAD, mutual assured destruction, is the key to stability. But what about the old-fashioned kind of stability where there's a big bully, a big powerful state facing a weaker one, has the ability to disarm it, and that's a form of deterrence too. So I want to be agnostic on that, at least again in my prepared remarks. What I will focus on, and let me get right to it, is one dimension of this topic, and that is whether advances in conventional counterforce should be seen as some kind of opportunity to reduce the reliance on nuclear weapons as a tool of deterrence and a source of strategic stability. Okay, so this is the substitutability arguments that some analysts make, that conventional weapons and other non-nuclear systems are becoming so effective, so lethal, that they can serve as a preferable alternative to nuclear weapons when it comes to national security. And simply put, are more effective and credible conventional counterforce capabilities a better option for bolstering deterrence and strategic stability than traditional yet costly and very risky reliance on nuclear weapons? My view is no. The most important deterrence missions, in other words, the foundation of strategic stability built on deterrence, still ultimately rest on threats to use nuclear weapons, not conventional weapons. And so I specifically want to tackle what I see as three main nuclear missions, and how does conventional counterforce potentially change this or not. The first mission, when I think of what do you need nuclear weapons for, it's to deter nuclear attack. A nuclear attack on your homeland, or in the case of the United States right now, a nuclear attack on one's allies. The second mission that I'll talk about is the mission of deterring conventional attack on your homeland, or again, on the homeland of your allies. And the third mission, primary mission that I see for nuclear weapons is to disarm a nuclear adversary. In other words, to deter or limit damage if deterrence fails. Okay. And the key question again is, can conventional weaponry displace nuclear weaponry for any or all of these missions? And I am, again, just to tell you my argument, I'm skeptical of that. First of all, deterring nuclear attack. At the most fundamental level, strategic stability rests on the credible threat to retaliate with unacceptable consequences if an adversary launches a nuclear attack. The key goal here is to threaten massive destruction, punishment, right? The goal, to quote Dr. Strangelove, the goal is to produce fear in the mind of, to paraphrase Dr. Strangelove, fear in the mind of the adversary, fear in the mind of a potential attacker about what will happen if they do launch a nuclear attack. This is about generating strategic effects, both physical and psychological. Given those objectives, I don't think any current or emerging conventional technologies or weapons can do this in any way comparable to nuclear weapons, right? In the US-Israel war against Iran, yet again demonstrates the futility of traditional conventional bombing campaigns as a means of punishing or coercing an adversary to surrender or cave in any meaningful way, right? Would bombing bridges and electrical plants change anything? I really don't think so. Would a massive cyber attack create strategic effects that would change anything either? Again, I'm just highly skeptical of that. It's very hard to make the case that the threat of conventional counterforce would be punitive or destructive enough that it would produce enough fear of even greater destruction to come to deter a nuclear attack by a highly motivated adversary. So, simply put, there's no substitute for the threat of nuclear retaliation when it comes to clarifying for an adversary the danger of nuclear attack. Okay, that's mission number one. Mission number two is to deter conventional attack. Strategic stability might also rest on the credible threat to dramatically escalate a conventional conflict in order to deter an adversary from attacking in the first place. Okay? The key goal here is to threaten to take the conflict to a far more destructive level, to escalate the conflict to a far more destructive and costly level than any potential attacker would be willing to bear to achieve its objectives. And the best historical example here is, of course, the US extended deterrence commitment to Europe in the Cold War, where the objective, and again, many students to this day are simply ignorant of this history, the objective that NATO and the United States had was to start nuclear war if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe. The goal was to use nuclear weapons first on the battlefield to deter the conflict, the invasion from happening in the first place. And if the invasion happened, to coerce a halt to it before the Soviets could overrun all of Western Europe. And therefore, it's no surprise by the 1970s, the United States deployed over 7,000 nuclear weapons, over 21 different types of nuclear weapons on NATO, West German territory in particular. Those weapons were not about defeating Soviet forces primarily, but rather ensuring that the war would go nuclear. Okay? So using nuclear weapons to deter conventional attack. It's no easy thing to do, but it is a major mission of at least the United States in the past, and increasingly a mission of U.S. adversaries today. In this context, there are no conventional counterforce capabilities that could generate a comparable threat of escalation, and thus a comparable threat of the danger of nuclear war to deter a conventional attack, right? Threatening to attack an adversary's nuclear forces in this context would do little to deter a conventional invasion. Indeed, it would make more sense to devote those conventional forces to winning the conventional battle, to waging a traditional goal of denial in warfare for defeating the adversary on the battlefield rather than going after its nuclear weaponry. So again, here again, nuclear weapons are unique in clarifying the danger. This time, in the context of this mission, the danger of starting a conventional war that could slide over the precipice to nuclear war. Okay, and that brings me to the final major primary mission of nuclear weapons, which is a preemptive disarming attack. Okay, finally, somewhat counterintuitively, strategic stability in some cases rests on the ability to credibly threaten to disarm any potential attacker, as I alluded to at the beginning of my remarks. If your adversary is reaching for the nuclear gun, I will shoot the gun out of your hand and leave you completely vulnerable. Okay, that is a deterrent effect of a preemptive disarming threat. Most people have been conditioned to think of stability coming from MAD, but peace can also flow from one side having a first strike option. And the question here again is, can conventional counterforce do the job? Can it do the job here? I think my answer is, okay, maybe someday, but not in the foreseeable future. I mean, we have seen, and Daryl Press and I are on record as showing in multiple places, that there have been revolutionary advances in conventional weapons accuracy and the accuracy of nuclear weapons as well. Conventional weapons accuracy, speed of targeting, time to target, remote sensing, the ability to find and track mobile missiles and submarines. And even in terms of cyber attacks on C3, command and control communications. But the key requirement, and we may try all of those things if the United States, for example, is trying to disarm North Korea, but the key requirement of a nuclear disarming strike is that you got to get them all, right? You need to destroy all of an adversary's nuclear weapons or delivery systems, or close to all of them, if you're somehow reasonably confident that a missile defense system, could defeat a small number of retaliatory launches. A missile defense system is kind of a mop-up for an attack that otherwise destroys most or all of those nuclear systems. All right. At least for now, and as far out as I can see, only nuclear weapons can potentially give you the PK, the probability of kill that you need to be confident enough to launch a disarming strike against an adversary's nuclear forces. As I mentioned at the beginning, conventional counterforce requires functioning GPS to get the kinds of accuracy and lethality and PK that you would need to target an adversary's hardened forces, to create hard target kill over pressure. And that might be a suspect assumption in any conflict. And if I think about other non-nuclear, non-kinetic approaches, they will always entail enormous uncertainty and an exquisite intelligence to carry out. Of course, nuclear weapons also depend on nuclear counterforce also depends on a lot of things like the reliability of delivery systems and accurate intelligence about target location, hardness levels, things like that. But the bottom line is nuclear weapons give you a huge margin for error, okay? And when it comes to disarming a nuclear adversary, few states are going to be willing to take risks that are unnecessary if you have the nuclear option. So once again, in this case, because of the relative ease of delivery and bang for the buck, nuclear weapons are uniquely good weapons for disarming an adversary. Just to conclude, ultimately, this is a good news, bad news story, right? The bad news, so to speak, is that conventional counterforce won't allow us to move toward a world that relies less on the nuclear sword of Damocles to keep the peace, right? But the good news is conventional counterforce is probably not as much of a threat to strategic stability as the conventional wisdom supposes, because when you look at the main missions that nuclear weapons are useful for and uniquely useful for, I don't see conventional counterforce replacing them and undermining the deterrence that those nuclear weapons produce. I'll leave it there. Happy to engage with any questions and discussion to come.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Lieber. So it looks like the nuclear Leviathan is here to stay. A lot of food for thought. Dr. Zhao, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think I will pick up on where Professor Leader left over, which is conventional counterforce, used as a disarming, using a disarming strike. I think there are two scenarios. One is you use conventional counterforce alone, the disarming strike. The other is to use a comprehensive combination of nuclear, conventional, cyber, etc., in a joint counterforce disarming strike. Let's first address the former scenario, a conventional alone counterforce disarming strike. And this scenario can be further broken down. Firstly, to use conventional counterforce among major nuclear powers. I think this is a very hard case to make. China, for example, has been prepared for a large-scale nuclear disarming strike. It has built, as you said, Manu, over years, extensive underground Great Wall infrastructure that is very survivable even against nuclear strike. So it would be really hard to destroy a major nuclear power's nuclear forces, and with high confidence, as Professor Lieber also said. And there is also no real military need to do so. Right? To launch a comprehensive, large-scale conventional counterforce disarming strike carries almost the same risk in terms of enemy retaliation as a comprehensive nuclear counterforce strike. So why only limiting yourself to using conventional weapons? And of course, regardless of whether a conventional counterforce strike or nuclear counterforce strike, the enemy can take effective countermeasures that could significantly reduce the military efficacy. Enemy can adopt launch on warning if they have the early warning capability and rapid launch capability. The enemy can pre-delegate nuclear launch authorities to military units. There might be a specific scenario where a purely conventional counterforce might make military sense, and that is at the very beginning of a theater level conflict between two major powers. For example, in the US-China war over Taiwan, at the beginning of the war, which is still at the conventional level, and neither side has used nuclear weapons. If the US perceives an imminent Chinese limited use of nuclear weapons at the theater level, right, involving those theater range nuclear missile systems deployed close to Taiwan on the mainland, perhaps a military case can be made that US could then try to use conventional weapons to preemptively destroy those small number of nuclear missiles China is now mobilizing and preparing for immediate launch. Right, that might provide less escalatory option than nuclear counterforce. But that's a very, I think, niche area. So the second scenario is use conventional counterforce disarming strike against a smaller nuclear rival. And in this case, South Korea's interest in conventional counterforce against North Korea, I think makes slightly more military sense. But still, I think it's a very challenging scenario. Not least because North Korea has many options to adopt countermeasures, including to further harden its nuclear weapon systems. And then, the real concern, I think, is a combined disarming strike campaign using nuclear, conventional, cyber, everything, including the laptop launch missile defeat, laptop launch missile defeat capabilities in a joint counterforce campaign. And obviously, this is the scenario that China potentially worries about. And the question then becomes, what's the role of the conventional weapons in this joint comprehensive campaign? I think conventional weapons might play a complementary role, especially against softer targets, mobile targets, perhaps road mobile missiles. If the attacker has exquisite ISR capability, if they can identify, monitor, track road mobile missile launchers with good confidence and precision, and if the attacker possesses dynamic kill chain, meaning that they have two-way communication capability between the ISR and the missile, then the conventional weapons might be useful to take out these softer targets. The caveat the caveat is, if we observe what is happening in recent wars, including the Iran war, we are just watching. The Iran war is basically a conventional counterforce campaign, right, conducted jointly by Israel and the United States against a much weaker enemy. But still, it proves the difficulty to hunt down missile launchers in a comprehensive way. Iran is still able to regularly launch dozens of missiles, ballistic missiles every day. So there is, that limit. And then, Manu, as you said, perhaps conventional weapons can be effective against, used in the functional defeat mode, targeting the underwater, the exits of China's underwater submarine facilities, so that they can block the nuclear submarines inside and disable them from immediate use. Perhaps conventional weapons can be particularly useful against mobile NC3 systems. Another concern, I think, that applies to China, North Korea, and other countries is conventional decapitation attack. We see this demonstrated by Israel and the United States against Iranian leadership. And I think for paranoid dictators, they do worry about conventional decapitation, even in a protracted war, or even in a conflict with enough prior warning, which was the case with the Israeli decapitation strike against Iranian leadership. There was always, the leadership cannot always hide in deeply and very hardened underground facilities all the time, right? For various reasons, including to appear publicly, to demonstrate, to help raise domestic morale. They have to, make some movements and even potential appearances. And then that often provides some opportunity for conventional decapitation. Right? The Chinese leadership is so paranoid about conventional decapitation. I think that contributes to Beijing's recent policy to shut down all the use of drones in Beijing. So this is, I think, a specific concern. Whether conventional counterstrike can be effective against ICBM silos, I think it is a debatable question. As Professor Lieber mentioned, it depends on a lot of other enabling capabilities, GPS jamming, etc. But from China's experts' perspective, I think they tend to see a constant competition between conventional offensive capability and defensive capabilities against such strike. Right, there is this competition about qualitative development of technology. In the case of China, Chinese experts have conducted extensive studies on both advancing conventional strike capability, but also in protecting against a conventional strike. Regarding the latter, there is extensive study on how to make underground facilities safe from conventional strike, including conventional penetration weapons. And the Chinese strategy includes at least 3 main efforts. The first effort is to counter the enemy's ISR, on which precision conventional strike depends. Right, so there are studies about how to counter optic sensors, infrared sensors, radar detection, etc. The second effort involves efforts to counter the precision part of conventional strike, right? How to use close-range interceptors to defend against a precision strike. How to use interferences, electronic warfare technology, etc., to undermine the precision guidance of conventional weapons. And here, I think the Chinese experts have observed what has happened during the Ukraine war, in which both the Russian side and Ukraine side successfully used GPS jamming to degrade the accuracy of the other's missiles, rockets, and precision bombs. And the third Chinese effort includes protection against a conventional explosion, right? Even if the conventional weapon successfully strike, there's many ways to minimize the impact from the explosion, right? How to deal with the blast wave, how to minimize the penetration capability of the weapon, how to counter the huge vibration caused by the explosion, how to protect against the shrapnels created by the explosion. There are systematic research into that. And of course, looking into the future, we also have to consider AI-enabled conventional counterforce capability, including to incorporate machine learning into into smart precision strike conventional weapons. So when it comes to qualitative development of technology, I don't think China, has concluded that either the offensive side or the defensive side has a definite advantage going forward. And then we have the quantitative competition, which means if you want to have effective conventional counterforce, you need to have a large-scale deployment of such weapons, right? One Chinese lesson watching the Russian campaign, Russian invasion against Ukraine is they think, the PLA experts think, the Russian conventional strike, including using missiles, rockets, etc., has been too thin and too scattered, and therefore not very effective in the Ukraine war. So you really require scaling, large-scale deployment and employment to have some desirable military effect. And then there is this competition between building low-cost conventional strike weapons, which would be particularly useful in a protracted conflict. But on the other hand, the target state may also be able to react in a affordable way, or in fact maybe in a cheaper way, by hardening their key facilities, etc., So it's also not very clear, even in the quantitative competition, whether the offensive side or defensive side holds a definitive advantage. So I will conclude by saying that for Chinese experts, this is an ongoing, this will remain a constant competition between offense and defense. And for us researchers, I think it is important to continue in-depth and balanced analysis into this question. We need to avoid, unbalanced or black and white type of conclusion, because ultimately the efforts to secure mutually assured destruction can become a very paranoid effort that drives unnecessary military investment and even arms competition. So as researchers, we definitely do not want to add oil, so to speak, to the fire of existing paranoia. In fact, I think the hope is we could help countries move away rather than move towards worst case scenario thinking. And in my observation, I tend to think that Chinese military planners have been too paranoid in some cases about the American capability to disarm China, and I just do not think that's a healthy tendency in China's strategic thinking. And maybe in-depth research can help us somewhat counteract against that tendency. So let me stop here, and also look forward to further discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Zhao. I completely echo your feelings on functioning on worst-case assumptions does not lead necessarily to good results. And indeed, more research is definitely needed in this area. It's also interesting that you mentioned about, which Professor Lieber wrote also, on this feasibility of conventional counterforce being more applicable to either theaters like the Korea Peninsula or indeed between vastly asymmetric rivals. So it is interesting here that we're moving away from the conversation of peer rivals to asymmetric rivals, but it's something to have in mind. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Zhao. Professor Plesch, the floor is yours now. You're muted, Professor Plesch.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I really appreciate Tong Zhao and Kia Lieber's contributions to this debate. I think I might start with Tong Zhao's very interesting and detailed discussion about Chinese actions and reactions. Clearly, this is an area that needs constant and detailed work, and also with the Russians. But I think part of the premise for our own research in this area is that overall, in Western scholarship, there's very, very little attention to this range of issues. And indeed, one sees studies about regional scenarios and procurements for a conventional accurate strike in Japan and East Asia, European acquisition programs, without putting them into the context of the strategic relationships. And as Tong Zhao very rightly explores, the Chinese have been paying very, very serious attention to this technical problem in endeavoring to manage it. And of course, we haven't mentioned so far that going back from well over a decade, the Chinese and Russian leadership sometimes together have warned and sought debates on the conventional sword and shield problem, as we put it. They use the more technical definitions. And this is at a time when very commonly in the West there is an accepted mantra that the West does not have reliable or interested partners on arms control in either Moscow or China. And yet main debates in the West pay no attention to these frequently stated positions. And indeed, in some of the actions, particularly we just heard from China in dealing with it. So that's one point of engagement and concern that motivates our studies. Now, of course, there are very great limitations on this kind of work. We only have to see the chaos of the current war with Iran, the rapidly evolving nature of the battlefield in Ukraine. But nevertheless, rarefied strategic calculations have, for example, informed major elite studies in the United States about nuclear force, so-called modernization, and age-old concepts, bizarre concepts, such as the Midwest acting as a sponge for Russian first strike. That these sort of notions gain almost theological validity without really being taken apart. So on the one hand, yes, one needs to have a much greater and more nuanced approach, but on the other hand, an awareness that when it comes to setting strategic cultures on these issues and indeed procurement decisions, sometimes they are driven by very rarefied, stripped down and barely realistic analyses. Now, I just want to come to a few of the bit of detail. I think the GPS and similar problems are indeed significant, but we know that quite a significant portion of these weapon systems are now equipped with sonar radar targeting. Now, obviously, jamming still comes in, but the fact that there is this arms racing on protection against targeting systems, I think points to the severity of the problem rather than to its absence. Now, I've long been a skeptic of missile defense effectiveness, mostly because it's always been presented, or usually presented, particularly by liberal arms controllers, as being something that happens, as we saw in the wonderful movie House of Dynamite, out of a clear blue sky. It just happens one day and you have to defend against it. And then it doesn't work enough and it costs too much. Well, as we have tended to touch on in this discussion, the idea of them being used in concert, sword and shield, and that the shield is there for residual launches, does give a somewhat different tenor to the discussion. And the fact that the US has developed and fielded air-launched standard missile with no impact on in a public discussion, as far as we can tell, is just one additional component. And a theme of our study was very much that technologies that have been around for 30, 40 years, and I think now of AMRAAM, that the technological capability of systems has transformed hugely and dramatically. Although for those people who deal with these technologies, they are often just seen to be have the associates of the old system. And I know distinguished colleagues in this regard who still think of Trident D5 having a CEP of 100 meters, whereas the latest public discussion of procurement for its targeting system puts it in a combination of GPS and radar sonar at 5 meters and less. And with AMRAAM, this has now got an operational radius of 100 miles from, or let us say, a diameter of 200 miles, which puts it in a very different position for dealing with boost and early mid-course interception. Now, you and I might think, well, this is all just worst case. And I would certainly encourage my own countrywomen to not indulge in worst case analysis. But unfortunately, this is what drives bureaucracies, promotions, and analysis all too often. And I think the position, as it were, from the other side of the hill is not as sanguine as some of us might like to think it is. That the threat perception, and to take case in point, although some people with a nod and a wink have said to me, well, you should look more closely at conventional Trident. If you are sitting on the other side of the hill and you see a system, and I would compare this to the nuclear Tomahawk, a system which is thought to be highly effective by the Defence Science Board, by the National Academy of Sciences, and has strong support from these quarters, that disappeared from the public budget 15, 20 years ago, but with no, despite its perceived quality, with no public lobby. Ostensibly is a system that, because of the likely confusion in crisis between a nuclear and a conventional weapon, that this was enough to turn it down. Well, in the Senate of and the Congress of the early 2000s, one can see that, but such sentiments don't really exist anymore, and they can also be applied to the nuclear Tomahawk, which has recently been fielded, but they had no impact on the decision to go ahead with the nuclear Tomahawk. And in comparison, if I was sitting again in an office in another capital, I would think that the political environment would require an extensive lobby for this capability, and yet there isn't one. Nothing comparable, for example, to the lobby for a nuclear Tomahawk. All of these things, from an analytic perspective, would make me think that I really need to think about a ballistic missile as well as a cruise missile threat. But just to end up on the Tomahawk, JASSM, and perhaps on the Japanese side also potentially the J-12, and the Europeans are rather shorter range in general in terms of their systems. The capability of this Rapid Dragon system, which has virtually no attention, both on the conventional battlefield, but just in terms of pure quantity, being able to use any transport aircraft, and the C-17, I think, getting on for 60 long-range, highly accurate, stealthy cruise missiles from a single transport aircraft. That these technological shifts, and of course the lack of constraint now that INF has gone on the deployment of dual-capable modular launch systems for both land attack and surface-to-air capability, all of these, I think, would mean that I would be far less sanguine about these calculations than some of us are, and that overall the Western strategic studies community needs to give a great deal more attention to this problem, if only to be able to provide a more coherent answer when one hears from Western leaders and associated institutes that we no longer have any reliable or interested counterpart on the Chinese and Russian side, at the same time as being culturally deaf to some of the key issues that they want to talk about. Well, I say this is just the beginning of a series of discussions, and I hugely appreciate the attention and time and perceptions of both Keir Liebe and Tong Zhao in helping us get things off to a good start. And I entirely agree that one shouldn't fuel paranoia, but look to diffuse it. Thank you very much, Manuel.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Plesch. I think all of us in the panel would likely agree that conventional counterforce is unlikely to substitute any kind of nuclear counterforce for the foreseeable future. But again, this greater integration of capabilities is definitely worth to discuss, as we've been doing. If I just may ask, Professor Lieber, so one of the from personal readings of your literature on this topic is that defenders face a kind of dilemma, which is every countermeasure they adopt tends to create a new vulnerability. For instance, strengthening air defense deployments essentially reveal the locations of the assets that they are protecting. Have you encountered any countermeasure that closes this vulnerability without opening another, or is this defender's dilemma inherently inescapable?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think I would just say in general that whether we're talking about the potential attacker or the potential defender, there is no ever a silver bullet, a final step in this hider, seeker, counterforce, defender dynamic. It is an action reaction cycle. If the United States, for example, is relying on SAR satellites for uniquely good capability of discovering and tracking mobile missile systems, the obvious response, which the Chinese have grasped, is anti-satellite technology, and then the response to that is anti-satellite efforts, which the United States is pursuing. And so I think it's just there is not going to be an end to this back and forth kind of competition. The only thing I will say in addition is that this is where it really matters, the technological sophistication of the various states involved. So when we made our argument a few years ago about that all countries' nuclear arsenals are becoming more vulnerable in the face of these technological trends in accuracy and in remote sensing, we were careful to say that not all countries' arsenals were becoming vulnerable the same way. And so for a country like the United States, we have a lot more responses and ability to respond to threats to our arsenal than, say, a North Korea. Again, where China is on this spectrum is a fascinating topic. But this new era of counterforce doesn't affect all countries equally. And in general, those that are wealthier, have more developed economies, and support their R&D budgets are in a better position to play and win the game than others.
Indeed. I think maybe a fundamental point is that technology is advancing faster than the analysis itself. So maybe that's something to have in mind. Thank you, Professor Lieber. Dr. Zhao, if I may, so you mentioned that this Chinese nuclear buildup is partly driven by this fear by policymakers in Beijing of this first strike disarming attack against Chinese nuclear forces without ever crossing the nuclear threshold. So if that perception is accurate, does it mean that US conventional superiority is actually undermining deterrence rather than reinforcing it? And is there anything that Washington could credibly do to reassure Beijing, or is that window already closed?
I think historically it's fair to say that among Chinese military experts, there has been a concern about US conventional counterforce capability. Just as there has been concern, or maybe even greater concern, about US homeland missile defense. But regarding what role this concern has played in the recent round of Chinese nuclear buildup, it's really hard to say with high confidence. Some international experts have very comprehensively reviewed or publicly written papers by Chinese military and civilian experts, all their publicly made comments, etc. And they did conclude that Chinese concern about U.S. missile defense and conventional capability are the major driver of Chinese nuclear modernization. But I think they didn't factor in the fact that, well, under China's internal political environment, that's the only factors the Chinese commentators can publicly point to as drivers, as justifications for China's nuclear modernization. They couldn't, even if there were other considerations, they couldn't openly say them. So I think we should be aware about that, inherent bias that could influence international evaluation of Chinese rationale simply because of the unique information environment in China. And this, of course, is Professor Lieber.
Well, I just want to jump in on to say something in the spirit of a conversation, not to take any issue with anything you said, Tong, but with the question itself, the idea that is there anything the United States can do to assure the PRC that that we don't intend to bolster our counterforce capabilities with conventional and nuclear, that they don't need to worry about the vulnerability of their arsenal. I think the premise of the question, which again is often posed by certain analysts to say, hey, why don't we show that the United States doesn't, mean you ill? I think there's nothing that the United States can do to assure China that would be truthful or honest, because that is the purpose of U.S. interest in counterforce capabilities. It is to address the threat coming from our most likely potential adversaries, and whether that's China or North Korea or Russia, that's something we're deeply interested in. So in a way, you're asking the question: how can the United States deceive China into believing that we don't see them as a potential threat and we want to bolster our military capabilities to deal with that threat?
If I may, I just want to further add a point. I think the relative balance of conventional capabilities between US and China is constantly evolving, and some people in China may argue the table will be turned, if not already, given that China has secured increasing advantage in conventional capabilities, especially at the theater level, but increasingly at longer range. It is China that has been leading the development and deployment of high-end conventional precision strike capabilities, hypersonic missiles. There is, reported Chinese development of conventional ICBM. And the US may be lagging, at least right now. Maybe US may catch up later, but I can see a scenario in the foreseeable future when it comes to a war between US and China over Taiwan, when the US worry about its declining conventional superiority, is doubling down on reliance on nuclear escalation to compensate for conventional inferiority, and starts to more forward deploy nuclear-capable systems to places near China. If U.S. decides to, develop conventional nuclear dual-capable land-based regional range missile systems and deploy them to Guam or to U.S. bases in the region, I can see the table being turned in the sense that China would enjoy overwhelming conventional counterforce capability against those limited U.S. nuclear or strategic capabilities in the region. So I think with the evolving balance of power, perhaps it's time that we can use both sides worry about conventional capability and their certain advantage to have a more equitable or equal based dialogue, so that both sides would recognize the need in self-restraint, and to provide as much reassurance as possible to the other side. Even though I agree with Professor Lieber, it's kind of hard to make that reassurance fully credible.
Can I even just tack on one more point, which is to say that the war against Iran and the depletion of U.S. interceptors, as well as offensive Tomahawk missiles, certainly isn't helping the balance of conventional power in a U.S.-China war over Taiwan from the U.S. perspective. And in fact, I would put I could see China possibly, if it's decided to start a war and invade Taiwan, that the U.S. entanglement in Iran makes it even more likely that they would do that. I would not be shocked if the odds of a war have gone up dramatically given U.S. weakness. And again, I used to always say, hey, would China use nuclear weapons in a war over Taiwan as the conventionally weaker power? If they're losing that existential conflict, might they be incentivized to use nuclear weapons? That was always been the model in my head. But as Tong said, as the conventional balance of power has shifted, and I don't know where it is right now. I would not bet on who would win a conflict over Taiwan if it stays at the conventional level. But increasingly, I agree that I could see the United States as being the one that might need to rely on nuclear systems because of its incoming conventional inferiority over Taiwan. 100% agree.
Fantastic discussions we're having. Just want to remind the audience to start thinking of your questions and just raise the hands. And if you want to direct any specific question to any specific panelists, do say so. But we're open. In the meantime, given this tit for tat of perceptions, the lack of need to appear rival, that our kind of promises are words and words are only relevant. Are they even relevant? Any prospects, and I pose this to the panel at large, any prospects, therefore, for any kind of arms control, given this greater integration between nuclear and conventional capabilities going forward, especially now?
I'll pick up first, perhaps, and follow on from a couple of the remarks. Perhaps I can start with the point about China looking at Russian missile strikes as being thin in Ukraine. Of course, the overwhelming reason for this is because the vast proportion of Russian, in fact, almost all of the Russian land-based missile capability of appropriate range have been destroyed under the INF Treaty. Thousands of weapons. And it's startling, I think, in terms of a field that characterizes itself as being objective and scientific, that there's almost no mention of the impact of the INF Treaty on Russian offensive surface-to-surface missile capability. And such strikes as they managed to launch into Western Ukraine, Lviv and so on, have overwhelmingly, or in the first years, come from sea-launched and air-launched systems. And this was very rarely commented upon in that context. So I think the direct benefits of arms control disarmament to the people of Ukraine, and indeed to the West in general, if we're coming to say, well, what are the benefits of pursuing arms control and disarmament? There is one in the explanation of Russian thinness in its ability to launch missile attacks on Ukraine. There's a very clear reason for that. I'm of an age, I remember the first Reagan administration and the evil empire and arms buildups, and the idea that one could have effective, verified arms control and disarmament agreements was a fantasy, and yet within a very few years they had in fact happened. And in that period, while the Soviet Union was still going, there were effective arms control and disarmament agreements across a whole range of sectors: conventional weapons, chemical a bit later, theatre, strategic, and so forth. So I think if this is thought to be a strategically desirable objective, one shouldn't be put off by the idea that previously it's been difficult. Give me a moment here. Now, with respect to China, the China-US relationship, of course, it's a very difficult and complex one. I would make a few, perhaps not entirely random points. One, I certainly remember conservative American officials simply saying we don't have a mutually assured destruction position with China, and we will never accept one. We'll never accept that relationship in the nuclear dimension. Now, you can argue whether that has, how far that's been eroded or not. When it comes to reassurance, I'm not entirely sure that all confidence security building measures are futile, but again, we need to be careful about being aware of what it is we actually do. And the fact that for decades, as happened with Russia, the US not only flew the territorial limits of China, but did so with airborne target acquisition and radar systems switched on. It was a decades lasting, I think, impact. If I was in the PLA, I wouldn't care for that at all. And the strategic depth that the United States has means that realistically, at the US-China level, I don't see Chinese technology overcoming sheer geography. Now, I'm something of a skeptic on Taiwan as well. I would love to see detailed comparison of the D-Day landings in Taiwan. D-Day landings were touch and go. Taiwan is further. Arguably, the weather tends to be worse. There's no air supremacy, no sea supremacy, and no Frenchmen with bottles of champagne on the beaches. But whatever the conclusion is of that comparison, what startles me is that the strategic studies community have not produced it as a comparison. It's a pretty obvious one. So I don't want to be sanguine about or over dismissive of the likelihood of Chinese attack being successful, but I do think it needs rather more robust examination than we've previously or very often seen. But are we going to open up the floor, Manuel? Or Kieran, you had a point, my friend.
Professor Lieber had a point.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to respond on the issue of the the benefits of arms control. I mean, your example of Russia and the INF suggests that this was an arms control agreement that was not in Russia's benefit in the long run. Isn't that the lesson? That again, it's a benefit to Ukraine, a benefit to the world that Russia sacrificed a capability that it eventually needed. But given that I've always been sort of a skeptic of arms control as an independent kind of factor in ameliorating conflict and tensions. In this case, the lesson is that this was a bad arms control agreement, and therefore, when you talk about why China won't engage in a new start with including them, their view is, why would we do this? This would be contrary to our own interest. And so unless you're advocating for arms control as a means of achieving unilateral advantage, competitive advantage, which is kind of how the United States approached arms control, strategic arms control in the Cold War, then I don't really see this as a great billboard advertisement for future arms agreements with Russia and China, for example.
Well, there's a whole other debate to be had here, but I think broadly, I think of President Merkin Muffley in Dr. Strangelove. Dimitri, we've always talked about something going wrong with the bomb, and I think that that's the mutual interest is not relying upon a deterrence idea, which is a historic concept and which at some point always fails. And we know where we end up with. We either end up with a nuclear winter coming out of our own first strike, or a mutual destruction and nuclear winter. And personally, I think one only has to look around at the extremely badly managed wars of this century by all the leaderships concerned, to think that relying upon this being sorted out by quote unquote wise men for the foreseeable future. I think that's what drives arms control and disarmament, as far as I'm concerned, is that we don't actually have any adult supervision, much as I wish it were the case.
Just to remind the audience, the floor is open. If you want to ask any question, just drop in the chat, or if preferably just ask the question directly with the mic. There's a comment by Javid Alam to you, Professor Lieber, if I may just quote very quickly. While I agree with Keir Lieber, there are important differences in how emerging technologies affect strategic stability, and treating them as a single category risks analytical oversimplification. He talks about hypersonic weapons, for instance, compress decision-making time and introduce ambiguity. Given these distinct characteristics, it may be more appropriate to adopt a graded or differentiated framework for analyzing such technologies rather than broadly grouping them together as conventional counterforce systems. Any comments on that, Professor Lieber?
I mean, it's unobjectionable to, be more nuanced in our treatment of different conventional counterforce capabilities. But again, I guess I would just return to the main point, which I gather, there's not a disagreement about, which is that there's a big difference between the conventional and the nuclear side. And unless, again, where my analysis, I think, would change or my thinking would change is if one could demonstrate that a particular kind of conventional technology, emerging technology, counterforce technology, would change the calculus behind each of these three major missions, then I think we're in a different world and having a different conversation. I mean, if quantum technologies mature in a way that leads to exquisite target location and precision strike, then maybe the disarming mission no longer needs to rely on nuclear weapons. That might be transformative. Again, the impact of quantum for the defender, the hider, though, can't be discounted. And so I haven't seen any treatment that of this or any other of the emerging technologies like hypersonics or cyber that clearly says this is decisively provides an advantage to either the hider or the seeker, the attacker, or the defender, or the counterforce, survivability kind of competition. So I have no objection to the comment. I agree with it. And to me, the big difference is the nuclear versus the conventional side.
Any comments, Dr. Zhao or Professor Flash? If not, I don't know how everyone with time.
I'm happy to briefly comment on arms control. I think it's really hard to do conventional arms control, given that that's perceived as the domain that the results of future wars will be decided. And China's military strategy is built upon to achieve, to prevail at the conventional level, including in the Taiwan contingency. And so when the goal is to secure conventional superiority, if not dominance, then it's hard to escape that zero-sum competition. But I think, at least in the foreseeable future, there will be growing mutual concerns in the Asia Pacific, despite China's largest in the world conventional missile arsenal. China has shown increasing worry about U.S. Joining the competition in conventional missiles. U.S. allies really accelerating conventional missile development. And this is happening across the region around China, from South Korea to Japan, to Taiwan, to Australia, etc. And there may be future opportunities for the US to deploy its own missile systems to the Philippines, etc. So there is a sense that China will be surrounded by US and US allied conventional missile capabilities along the first island chain. And if given this real concern, I mean, it's hard to, I think, China probably doesn't need to worry too deeply given its overwhelming advantage in this area. But the concern is real. So maybe that would offer some opportunity to talk about this emerging regional missile competition, if not arms race, as a subject for a regional level dialogue. I would not call it arms control because we are so far away from serious arms control negotiation, but it's a ripe topic for regional dialogue to help every side appreciate that there are genuine concerns in other countries about their conventional missile programs. And I think it's also an opportunity to encourage China to apply its own security principles to address this concrete problem of an emerging regional missile competition. China likes to say it supports arms control on the principle of indivisible security or undiminished security for all, which means anyone's development of military capabilities shouldn't threaten other countries' legitimate security interest. That's a lofty principle, but how to apply that to the operational level issues? And here is a good example. Right? We are seeing regional missile competition that China feels threatened about. So how would China suggest methods to operationalize its own principle? What types of missiles would China regard as posing unnecessary threat to other countries' legitimate security interest? What types of missile deployment could be regarded as possessing threats to other countries' legitimate security interest? I think eventually we want to use such talks to encourage awareness of security dilemma in national thinking. We want to mitigate self-righteousness in national thinking, and that's the underlying challenge. And I think the emerging missile technology competition is perhaps an opportunity to have that dialogue. It may not lead to immediate arms control, but hopefully it can enhance regional actors' awareness of how one's own military development creates real and genuine threat perceptions in other countries, and how it is in their own interest to try to understand and even address such threat perceptions.
I very much welcome those remarks, and I think those are things that we would hope to be able to build upon. I won't reply in detail because we're approaching the end of time, and as the hosts, I want to leave room for our guests, but we will be having more of these discussions, and I think you point to a potentially very fruitful area for us to take these discussions forward, and I thank you very much for that.
Indeed, if analysis is playing catch up with these technological advances, arms control is even more playing catch up. We have no other questions from our audience. At the same time, the developments, I think all of us agreed that maybe we should go down a step in talking about strategic stability with regard to conventional counterforce. And instead of discussing between peer rivals, maybe between asymmetric rivals would make more sense. You mentioned, Dr. Zhao, about Japan, for example. It should be emphasized that Japan is developing quite considerable counterforce capabilities. They term it counter-strike. Even their own missile defense system, they're putting Aegis afloat, for example, which again does show that there is a global proliferation of these conventional capabilities, and I think that's worth having in mind. We have
there is a question from Tom Kono, by the way, in the chat.
Yeah, so from Tom Kono, for the US, is it strategic primacy, not strategic stability, that has driven its nuclear and conventional policies, particularly since its withdrawal from the ABM treaty? The decline of arms control is a natural consequence of its quest for strategic primacy.
I'm happy to take the first answer at this.
Go on.
I think.
Please go ahead, Professor Lieber.
I think it's quite clear that the quest for strategic primacy has not only guided U.S. grand strategy in addition to nuclear policy and conventional weaponry policy since the withdrawal from the ABM, but way before the withdrawal from the ABM treaty. I would argue that the United States in the Cold War was deeply interested in escaping MAD.
Exactly.
Again, you don't have to be Ronald Reagan and I want to build some magical shield to protect me from the adversary. We were never content with MAD and living under this kind of vulnerability. Again, not just in the 1980s, but in the 1960s and 1970s, 1950s, you name the decade, we were never content to live in the shadow of nuclear destruction as a means of achieving security. And moreover, again, given my own, my theory of international politics, which could fairly be characterized as an offensive realist, I believe that states are always looking for opportunities to expand their relative power, and in certain cases, becoming a regional hegemon is ideal. And in this case, achieving nuclear primacy, I think, is the driving force. Again, there's so much else going on in addition to that. Individual personalities, bureaucracies, inter-service rivalry. I'm not denying that those aren't also causes of this. But we are not, the United States, has never been content to live under strategic stability.
I concur. Well, we're coming up to the 90 minutes, Manuel. So do you want to wrap us up?
Yes, I think that's a point of agreement. I think was pretty good points to end. I'd like to thank for our fantastic panelists, Professor Lieber, Dr. Zhao, and Professor Plesch, for your time and for your expertise, and to our audience for your presence and for taking the time to have a participation in this very vital topic. Wishing everyone a fantastic day, and do stay tuned for our second part of our webinar series. We have an equally fantastic panelist that desire to be involved. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good day or evening.